Hello and welcome to Western Civ, episode 285, Henry II, King of France. Both Henry and Catherine were 28 years old when they became King and Queen of France. Amazingly, though Catherine was now queen, Diane de Poitiers continued to dominate Henry's life. During the early years of his reign, Henry basically excluded his wife from his confidences. This was going to change later on. But for the moment, of the three people in this relationship, the Queen of France finished third. The French people welcomed the start to Henry's reign. Just like the end of Henry VIII's reign in England, Francis's reign had ended with the slow descent of a clearly dying king. Unfortunately, Henry's reign would prove to be even more dominated by factions than his father's had been. While the nobles Henry enriched loved him unconditionally, he created a second group of excluded nobles and high-ranking officials who hated both their monarch and the queen. This would be a major problem for Catherine when Henry unexpectedly died 12 years later. Henry benefited from the same optimism that always seems to greet a young king. People simply did not know very much about him. They knew he had been a brave soldier, that he loved the hunt, and that he seemed less inclined to the extravagance of his father's reign. The latter especially people liked. Perhaps Henry would not be so interested in bankrupting his people to pay for his own vices as Francis had been. Henry also followed in the footsteps of many young ascending monarchs when he instituted what I guess today we would call a general restructuring of the government. That is to say, he fired all his father's ministers and replaced them with his own men. These weren't all young friends, though, like Henry VIII had done initially in England. In fact, the biggest change and beneficiary was Henri de Montmorency, the aged soldier Henry so much admired. Henry delegated much of the business of running the realm to Montmorency, who, for his part, worked assiduously to keep all but the most important affairs from ever reaching Henry's proverbial desk. He likely didn't have one. Pregnant for much of the early years of Henry's reign, Catherine spent those years watching him reward his friends for their loyalty. Apart from Montmorency, the powerful Guise family was the biggest beneficiary of his success. But of course, the person who benefited the most from Henry's ascension was his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. No one could fail to notice the way in which Henry almost literally showered Diane with jewels, honors, and estates. For the rest of his reign, he continued to heap riches, offices, and honors upon her and her family and her supporters. One contemporary wrote of Diane and the others of the king's inner circle, quote, "Nothing escaped their greedy appetites, as little as a fly escapes a swallow. Positions, dignities, bishoprics, every good morsel were all greedily snatched." End quote. Now, Catherine got some gifts as well, because Catherine as queen also saw her interests advanced. But her advancement was more practical, you would say. Her cousins, the Strozzi, had been recently thrown out of Florence. Henry took them in, gave them positions at court, and even placed them in military roles, where they might hope to take back their home city. Catherine had always had an Italian entourage around since she arrived in France. But now as queen, this group swelled in size and importance. She also imported Italian craftsmen and no small amount of Italian clothing, giving her court a distinctive Italian flair. Henry's coronation took place at Reims on the 26th of July, 1547. Henry had been somewhat transformed in the past several years. Certainly, no one would describe the man as jovial or outgoing. But the melancholy, so much a part of his personality ever since years as a prisoner in Spain, finally seemed to melt away. On November 12th of that same year, Catherine gave birth again, this time to a daughter named Claude. Now, interestingly, while much has been made about Diane de Poitiers' influence over the king, we have little evidence of her direct influence making a difference in terms of foreign policy. Instead, what we do see is Diane acting as a sort of counterbalance against the rising power of the ultra-conservative Guise family, who will play a major role in our French narrative from now on. In April 1548, after spending 8 months at Fontainebleau, Henri, Catherine, and the court left the chateau. The king now had important matters to deal with in order to keep his foothold in Italy and maintain good relations with Pope Paul III. The Pope had now fallen out with the Emperor, and Henri decided to make the most of this breach by appearing to support the Pope's interests. The Pope's grandson, Orazio Farnese, had been brought up at the French court, and to tie the two dynasties together, Henri promised his illegitimate daughter, Diane de France, in marriage to him. Earlier, in 1544, the Pope's son, Pier Luigi Farnese, had been awarded the duchies of Parma and Pienza by his father. The emperor had been greatly provoked by this, because he considered Parma and Pienza as part of the Duchy of Milan, and therefore imperial territory. Besides, the emperor ensured that he had a strong military presence to protect his interests in northern Italy. Shortly after Henri's coronation, news arrived that imperial agents had murdered Pier Luigi. Henri received urgent entreaties from the Pope, asking him for help to avenge the killing of his son. Henri was eager for war, but Montmorency, full of foreboding at this prospect, counseled caution at the moment. When Henri could summon neither the Venetians nor the Turks as allies for this proposed military venture, he decided to take this opportunity to show his solidarity for the Pope by making a journey to Piedmont, most of which was controlled by France. During his absence, Henri created a council of 5 and made Catherine his nominal regent. Catherine, once again pregnant, had a difficult regency in Henri's absence. Revolt swelled as a result of Henri's tax on salt. Henri got word of the trouble and rushed back to France in early September 1548. And in the end, he had to use the military to crush the rebellion that he caused. In October 1548, Catherine gave birth to a 4th child, another son named Louis. As per tradition, he was now made the Duke of Orleans. Yet, despite the fact that Catherine was doing everything that was asked of her, Diane continued to reap rewards. That same year, Henri made her a member of the nobility, which meant that now Catherine could not even avoid her husband's mistress at major state events. Surely it was a blow. However, when Henri made his first official entrance into Paris as king, he had the good sense to at least keep allusions to Diane out of the festivities. Was it a big win? Probably not. But it was a win, nonetheless. Now, as a quick aside, almost a year before Catherine's coronation, a very important young person arrived in France, seeking refuge, someone I'm going to do a whole deep dive on later on. In August 1548, during Henri's short absence in Italy, a 5-year-old girl, Mary, Queen of Scots, fled her troubled kingdom. The young queen had come at Henri's invitation, following the urgent requests of her uncles, both members of the conservative Guise family. Their sister, the widowed Queen Mother, Mary, Queen of Guise, finding herself increasingly embattled by English invaders, had sent her daughter to safety at the French court. Since her birth, Mary had been the object of a planned marriage alliance with Henri VIII's son, now King Edward VI of England. But the French, as we know, had no wish to see England and Scotland united. The Scots, always fearful of what they called the, quote, English bear hug, end quote, I love that, by the way, decided instead to ally their child queen by marriage to Henri and Catherine's eldest son, the Dauphin, Francis. Henri agreed to bring up Mary at the French court and, if necessary, fight for her inheritance. The project did not delight everyone. In particular, Diane and Montmorency felt uncomfortable about the added prestige that Mary's presence would afford the Guise family. French opponents of the match kept quiet, however, as the English threatened to overwhelm the Scots militarily. So Henry sent Catherine's cousin, Leon Strozzi, with 15 galleys carrying an armed force with her to aid the Scots. He succeeded in capturing the castle of St. Andrews, and among the prisoners was the Scots' fiery Protestant reformer John Knox, condemned to the galleys, something that probably added to the anger to his furious hatred of Queen Elizabeth later on. So by September 1547, there were already serious conversations going on about evacuating Mary, Queen of Scots, to France. Each side, Scotland and France, quickly agreed that Mary needed to get out of Scotland. So Mary arrived off the coast of Brittany on the 13th of August, 1548. By mid-October, 1548, that same year, Mary had reached Saint-Germain, which today is a western suburb of Paris. Henri declared Mary to be, quote, the most perfect child I have ever seen, end quote. Didn't say that about his own kids. Henceforth, Mary was to be treated as though she were another of the royal children. Henri was nearly as involved with her education and upbringing as was Catherine, quite remarkable for the age. Now, speaking of Catherine's children, as I alluded to before, with the exception of Margot, they were frequently sick. For whatever reason, the Dauphin Francis had been sickly from birth. The other two girls, Elizabeth and Claude, were constantly ill. As a result, the children were shuttled from place to place as the royal couple sought to remove them from the nearly constant outbreaks of plague. Mary, Queen of Scots, was seemingly made of a stouter constitution. She rarely got sick and remained with Henry and Catherine, where she not only enjoyed their support and protection, but that of the powerful Guise family. In the spring of 1549, the English were finally beaten back from Scotland, so Henry decided it was time to take Boulogne back for France. During the summer, the French massed a large army near Ardèche, which lay inland, near Calais and Boulogne. On August the 8th, 1549, Henry declared war on England and left Catherine, traveling north to lead the attack upon the heavily fortified town. After disappointing skirmishes, fighting continued in an on-again, off-again fashion until early the following year, when peace talks began in earnest. On the 24th of March, 1550, peace was signed, and at the cost of 400,000 écus, Boulogne, having been in English hands since 1544, was ceded back to France. The peace accord was sealed with the marriage of King Edward VI to the Princess Elizabeth. Obviously, the two were still young children, so the marriage did not literally take place. This was an expected marriage, one that would never be fulfilled. Around this time, on October the 24th, 1549, the 9-month-old Louis, Duke of Orleans, died. He was the first of Henry and Catherine's children to die, and it stung the royal couple to the core. Luckily, the following year, 1550, the Queen gave birth to another son, Charles Maximilian, the future Charles IX. Henry started his reign by deliberately offending the emperor. As Charles V was also Count of Flanders, and in this capacity technically a vassal of France, Henry demanded that Charles come and pay allegiance to him at his coronation. This offended the much older emperor, who replied that he'd be delighted to attend, but only at the head of 50,000 men to teach Henry a lesson in manners. Shortly afterwards, when the king was preparing to take Boulogne, Charles sent him a message warning that if he proceeded, he would come and, quote, treat him like a young man, end quote. Henry replied by calling the emperor, quote, an old dotard. While trading insults with his enemy, the king set about organizing the army and his defenses. Upon the election of Pope Julius III, the question of Parma re-emerged, when the new pope backed Charles' demand that Parma be returned to him. The Farnese appealed to Henry, who, encouraged by Catherine and the Guises, signed a treaty in May of 1551, promising to help the family hold on to their duchy and therefore involve France once more in Italy, because that always turns out. Catherine saw military intervention in the peninsula as an opportunity to reclaim her rightful inheritance from Cosimo de' Medici, Duke of Florence and vassal to the emperor. The idea of capturing his wife's rightful patrimony inspired Henry, who hoped either to re-establish a nominal republic there, supervised by the Strozzi and dependent upon France, or put one of his own sons on the ducal throne. Some provision clearly had to be made for the ever-increasing number of Valois boys in the nursery. The Guises were always more interested in Italian conquest than those against England, for their ancestors, quote, fancied themselves as kings of Naples, Sicily, and Jerusalem through their lineage to the Duke of Anjou, end quote. Though it is fair to say that Henry's eyes were generally turned to the northern parts of Italy and his wife's possessions, he was not unsympathetic to the interests of the Guise family further south. When war finally broke out in Italy, this time between Parma and the Papal States in June of 1551, both sides were backed by their superpower rivals. As with most of these interminable wars, the only winners were the bankers, who issued loans to both at steep interest rates. As no conclusive successes were scored by the French and the Pope announced both his desire for peace and peace talks, military efforts in Italy grew unpopular. Montmorency, sensing his moment, denounced the Italians at court, who had encouraged Henry to become involved in a pointless struggle. This was a barely veiled attack on the Strozzi, the Guise, and of course, Catherine herself. 2 days before Catherine gave birth to the Duke of Anjou, a mysterious incident occurred involving her cousin, Leon Strozzi. Stationed at Marseille, he had fled to Malta, taking 2 French galleys with him, having one of his subordinates killed. The man had apparently been plotting against him. But by fleeing his post, Strozzi left himself open to accusations of treason, cowardice, and desertion. The consequent problem threatened not only the rest of the family but the Queen herself, who had promoted her cousins whenever she could. We don't really know what happened and what the motives of everyone involved were, but Catherine well understood that the whole family risked having its honor and standing at court impugned by Leon's flight. Dragging herself from her maternity bed, she took swift action to limit the damage. Throwing herself at the mercy of the king, she managed to coax Montmorency into helping her by showing herself to be just as outraged as he was. In her terror, she wrote to Montmorency that she was, quote, la plus ennuyée, most vexed, adding, quote, I wish to God that he had drowned, if only God had taken him from this world before he fled. But I believe that he will recognize his mistake and not linger in this world, which would be the greatest news I could have, for I am certain he would not act in bad faith, end quote. Unfortunately, Leon did not have the good manners either to drown or kill himself, but had, she soon learned, arrived safely in Malta. This prompted another emotional letter to Montmorency, saying that she was greatly despaired and was daily increasing in her pains, and asking only that Leon should be allowed to explain himself to the king. Catherine also wrote a nervous rant to her husband, writing, quote, I beg you to forgive me if I annoy you with so long a letter, and to excuse me, considering the grief I feel that the person of whom I have spoken to you so much, and who is what he is to me, should have wronged you at a time when I hope to serve you well, and the only thing that would console me would be to hear that God had drowned him, end quote. Her loud protests against her cousin and supplications to Henri and Montmorency must have had a good effect, for Leon was allowed back to court 2 years later, and thanks to Catherine, the reputation of the Strozzi remained unaffected by the scandal. Apart from seeing her cousins extricated from a potentially disastrous situation, Catherine had another reason to feel more cheerful. Henri had for some time now been showing the Queen greater tenderness and affection. It was also around this time that Henri began to seek Catherine's advice on political matters for the first time. During the second half of his reign, he would do this more and more often. She now entered her second regency as Henri went with the army to fight the emperor. On January the 15th, 1552, Henri signed the Treaty of Chambord. This was basically an alliance with the German Lutheran princes against the Emperor Charles V, whose issues were, as we know, rapidly pushing him toward retirement. The next month, Henri formally declared war on the emperor. His real aim was never to help the German princes. There were a few key French-speaking towns and villages on France's northeastern border that would make excellent acquisitions if Henry could extort them from the emperor. As we will see throughout the late 16th and then early 17th century, these religious wars were often not at all about religion. When Catherine heard she was to be regent, she was overjoyed, but that joy was cooled when she found out that she would have to share the honor with one of Diane de Poitiers' lackeys. Working hard on Henry's behalf, Catherine discovered that she enjoyed the power that came with her rank and the untapped resources she possessed. By late June, Henry and his armies returned home after successfully occupying the new territories with almost no loss of life. From now until just before the end of his reign, Henry, Catherine, and France were to enjoy only the briefest respites from consequences of the ongoing Habsburg-Valois enmity. The battlegrounds for their almost continuous feuding would be Italy and the northeastern border between France and the Holy Roman Empire. In November of 1552, the emperor, armed with a huge force and determined not to allow Henry to hold on to his prestigious gains in the northeast, laid siege to the fortress city of Metz. There followed a ferocious 6-week bombardment of the city, the defense of which was led by Francois of Guise. Though he had only 6,000 men and a handful of guns, Guise, helped by Piero Strozzi, set about improving the city's lamentable defenses. Guise's leadership was so inspiring, as he himself labored with a shovel alongside his men rebuilding vital walls, that he even persuaded the citizens to lend a hand in the demolition of their own houses and churches to fortify the city. One man wrote of Guise, quote, "He was not seen wasting a single hour," end quote. His efforts were rewarded, as the town held out until the bitter cold of winter decimated Charles's exposed troops. The imperial soldiers died in scores every day. Dysentery, typhus, hunger, and cold. These were France's true weapons outside Metz. When Charles called off the siege in January 1553, Guise showed humanity, rare in 16th century warfare. When he rode out of the city to help organize treatment for the sick and dying enemy soldiers, his reputation for saving Metz with such puny defenses was already that of a hero, defying impossible odds. Such charity to the defeated foe added only further luster to his name. While the Metz problem was being satisfactorily resolved, an opportunity arose for France when the Tuscan city-state of Siena rebelled against the empire. In July of 1552, shouting the war cry of Francia, Francia, the Sienese revolted against the Spanish garrison that had been stationed there for 12 years. The rebels asked to be taken under Henry's protection, who needed little prompting to accept the offer. Siena provided a perfect springboard from which to launch attacks on both Florence, where they hoped a popular rising from within would help them, and the Papal States. Catherine felt overjoyed. The situation brimmed with promise for the overthrow of Cosimo and the liberation of Florence. Without wasting any time, Henry sent the Cardinal d'Este with his representative to Siena and a bodyguard of nearly 5,000 men. In reality, this was a small army. Of course, Catherine passionately and energetically supported the Italian venture. Henry, maybe in bowing to her request, replaced d'Este in Siena with Piero Strozzi, who arrived there on the 2nd of January 1554. With financial support, he was then to lead an attack on Florence, bringing Tuscany under French control. Catherine busied herself raising money from the Italian financiers in France, and even added 100,000 écus of her own by mortgaging properties that she had inherited from her mother. She also received Montmorency's grudging backing for the campaign. This, not an inconsiderable achievement, was due largely to Montmorency's jealousy of the military laurels being heaped upon Francois of Guise, and his desire to get some for himself. As well as her activities on behalf of the campaign in Tuscany at Reims, Catherine was accorded her third regency, while Henry went off again to fight the imperial troops now stationed in Picardy. Charles V's army arrived in May of 1554 to besiege Siena, and Strozzi's invasion of Florentine territory spelled disaster for France. Strozzi suffered an overwhelming defeat at the Battle of Marciano on the 2nd of August 1544, but eventually managed to reach Siena despite being badly wounded. Catherine raved about the cowardice of the Italian soldiers and dispatched Piero's valet to find his master and nurse him back to health. There followed a long, hard siege of Siena by Imperial and Florentine troops before the city fell in April 1555. By then, Piero's brother Leon, who had returned to favor after the Malta fiasco, had been given command of the galleys in the Mediterranean and had been killed in action. The news of Leon's death was, on Henri's express orders, withheld from Catherine for a few days because of the imminent birth of their daughter Marguerite, known as Margot. The king initially felt sorry for Strozzi upon losing his brother and created him a Marshal of France. But when Siena fell, Henri finally lost patience with Catherine's favorite cousin for his brave but ultimately ineffective action in Italy. When Piero managed to escape and return to France, he was received with such coldness that Catherine advised her cousin to stay out of the king's sight. Frankly, even before Siena had fallen, Henri was putting out tentative peace feelers to Cosimo de' Medici, while at the same time assuring Catherine that he would not abandon the campaign. Meanwhile, as we will soon return to England, some dramatic changes on the international landscape took place. On July the 8th, 1553, Edward VI of England died and was succeeded by his half-sister, Mary Tudor. Charles V, now infirm and suffering from crippling gout, had seen his dream and France's nightmare realized when his niece, the new Queen of France, married his son, the Philip of Spain. After failing to retake Metz in 1553, Charles had observed that it was clear that he had, quote, no real men left and must take leave of the world and get to a monastery, end quote. Accordingly, he started the preparations to hand over control of his empire to his son, Philip. His unwieldy and almost bankrupt empire had broken him, but he wanted accord with France before he withdrew from public affairs altogether. The French, too, were in a poor financial position, and the people now rapidly grew disenchanted by this interminable warring. But now a glistening temptation presented itself before Henri, which even distracted him from these crucial peace talks. Following the death of Julius III in March of 1555, and that of his successor Marcellus II, who wore the papal tiara for just 21 days before he died, a pope openly hostile to the empire was elected. Pope Paul IV succeeded Marcellus II on the 23rd of May. He hated the empire, and he nursed fantastic ambitions for his nephew. His favorite nephew, Cardinal Carlo Carafa, was a particularly loathsome man, a vicious one-time soldier of fortune, now masquerading as a prince of the church. Carafa received the position of His Holiness's Secretary of State, the papacy's most senior minister. The new regime in Rome made seductive overtures to the French for an alliance in which each other would support the other's claims. Catherine urged Henri not to let this opportunity slip. With papal backing, she argued their Italian ambitions could hardly fail. Most people at court supported this view, especially the Guises. Naples formed a crucial part of Pope Paul IV's tempting promises to Henri. It was agreed that the Pope would bestow Naples upon Charles Maximilian, Henri's second son, and Milan was to go to Edouard André, his third. Guise expected to become regent of Naples during Charles Maximilian's minority. In addition, the Pope pledged his support for the overthrow of Cosimo de' Medici, ensuring Catherine's formidable assistance. The Venetian ambassador, Michel Soranzo, wrote confirming of Catherine's growing importance at court. Quote, the Queen will have all the merit should France be liberated, end quote. Diane de Poitiers, too, had been promised a fine harvest for herself from the Pope, so she threw her weight behind the war party. Practically, the only dissenting voice left to be heard was Montmorency. He argued that the Pope was not in a position to fulfill any of these promises, that the papal treasury was empty, and that the Pope had no allies within Italy. All true. But everyone who mattered ignored Montmorency's doom-laden muttering, and the Franco-Papal alliance was signed on the 15th of December, 1555. A few months later, Cardinal Carafa arrived in France, ostensibly in the, quote, holy task of peace, end quote, but in reality, with only the most warlike of intentions. The treaty frightened Philip of Spain, still inexperienced and ruling without his father to guide him. Charles had abdicated by January 1556 and broken up the empire. Philip was now King of Spain, Duke of Milan, King of Naples, and sovereign of the Low Countries. Charles's brother, Ferdinand, was elected Holy Roman Emperor later that year. After much blustering, Henry and Philip signed the Treaty of Versailles, a 5-year truce in February of 1556. Given that France had just allied with the papacy, and Philip had recently been excommunicated for not awarding Cardinal Carafa the See of Naples, it was highly unlikely that either party really viewed the treaty as more than a chance to draw breath before the outtake of further hostilities. Philip felt so unnerved by these events that he wrote asking his father to help and aid him, adding that his enemies, quote, would behave differently, end quote, if they knew that Charles were there to counsel him. But despite this plea, Philip soon established that he was equal to the challenges Henry now threw at him, at what proved to be the military climax of his reign. Having given birth to a boy, Hercules, during the last days of the Siege of Siena in March 1555, Queen Catherine made her final maternal obligation to France by giving birth to twin daughters, Jean and Victoire, on the 24th of June, 1556. She had borne Henry 10 children in 12 years. But the arrival of these twins nearly cost Catherine her life. On the 15th of September, 1556, the Duke of Alba, Philip's viceroy in Naples, launched an attack on the Campania region, provoked by the Pope, who wanted to spark off a war in order to commit France to support him without further delay. Yet, the unexpected speed of Alba's approach toward Rome terrified Paul IV, and he appealed for help from Henry as imperial troops once again loomed down on the Eternal City. Henry dispatched Francois of Guise, who, aside from rescuing the Pope, intended to take Naples. Catherine immediately set to work raising money and men from the Italian exiles to aid the Guise expedition. The Duke's Italian allies, Este and Cardinal Carafa, argued about what his campaign goals should be when the three men met in February of that year, each resolutely promoting their own interest. Thwarted by these rather useless allies, and checked in by an attempt to take Florence, Guise marched south to Naples, but he still lacked support, funds, and men. Hearing now that the turncoat Pope was seeking a separate peace with the Duke of Alba, Piero Strozzi brought Carafa's two great-nephews back to France with him as hostages. When he arrived, where Henry and Catherine were expecting him, the Queen, who was at dinner when she heard of his arrival, dropped all protocol and rushed to embrace her husband. The King and Queen spent the rest of the evening poring over campaign plans with Strozzi, now rehabilitated in the King's eyes, before he returned to the royal mess unfolding in Italy. While Guise struggled with the maze of obstacles in Italy, Philip's ally, the King of Savoy, invaded northern France. Montmorency and his army stood before him at Saint-Quentin in Picardy. This vital stronghold, approximately 80 miles from Paris, is situated near the end of the river Somme, as it flows toward France's northeastern border with the Empire. On the 10th of August 1557, battle was joined, and Montmorency suffered a catastrophic defeat. Although Saint-Quentin itself had not fallen, it was completely surrounded, and the French army routed. Montmorency had been taken prisoner, and those nobles who were not killed went into captivity with him. Among them were some of the most important men in France, including some of Henry's closest companions. 45 miles away, Henry received the news with calm. Catherine, who had been made regent again, was already in Paris, a city gripped with panic as people scrambled to escape from the enemy, who now had nothing to bar their advance to the capital. On August the 29th, the town of San Quentin fell, despite numerous assurances from the commander of the town that it would not. The route to Paris now lay open. This unleashed a fresh wave of panic through France, and Henri's leadership fell into serious question. Yet, luckily for France, Philip delayed. He took a few defenseless towns, but that only cost him time and gained him nothing. There is a chance that Philip feared he might overextend himself by pressing on to take Paris, but I don't buy that. He didn't have to keep or even take Paris. By threatening directly, he could have ended the war, then and there. Henri then decided upon a course of action that would avenge the humiliation of San Quentin and remove the last English thorn remaining in France from the 100 Years' War. He would, at long last, capture Calais, so long in enemy hands. This foreign foothold was especially dear to Philip's wife, Queen Mary of England, and as an added bonus, it would thus also wound the Spanish king deeply. It was a bold and unexpected move. The town considered impregnable and the weather unfavorable for such an expedition. Even Guise felt skeptical about the plan. Strozzi was sent to examine the fortifications, and after his conclusions brought back to the king, Henri decided to press ahead. The element of surprise would be so great that he ignored the caution of his commanders. Guise was to lead the force against the town. After a brilliant attack, the garrison commander surrendered on the 8th of January 1553. Catherine and Henri were actually in the midst of a wedding banquet in Paris when news arrived of the victory. The people's joy was unbounded. Henri departed for the front, taking the Dauphin with him, leaving Catherine in charge of the government during his absence. Now, while all this was going on, religious divisions in Paris continued to intensify. On May the 13th, 1558, a massive Protestant demonstration took place in Paris. Now, this demonstration was different because amidst the throngs of these 4,000 Protestants, there were several noblemen. Henri was disgusted by what he interpreted as the contamination of the nobility by the Protestant scourge. The problem, of course, was John Calvin in nearby Geneva. Calvin, operating from Geneva, had created a far more effective proselytizing organization than earlier Protestants. His agents were now slipping into France and spreading the new doctrine. Among the repressive measures taken were the death penalty with no right of appeal for preachers and those coming in from Geneva distributing Protestant literature. This covered anyone fomenting religious unrest. At the same time, Henri had asked the Pope's permission to create a French Inquisition. 3 cardinals, in fact, were chosen to lead the body. But Henri had difficulty with the magistrates, who balked at the Inquisitor's authority. Secular courts were given additional powers to act against the Calvinists, but progress was slowed by confusion as to which legal body had the jurisdiction to enforce harsh new measures. One thing was quite clear, however. In order to stop this spreading within his realm, Henri felt he needed to implement an edict and wage a war against heresy. Henri now began to turn against the Guise family, though because they supported her Italian campaign, Catherine stood by them. The problem was that Catherine didn't want a peace treaty to imperil her ambitions in Italy to help her family. That was why she still supported the Guises, but as we have seen with religion, Henri now had other priorities. After tremendous haggling and changing his mind at least once, Henri agreed to a peace treaty, the merits of which have been hotly debated ever since. The most important terms of the Treaty of Château-Cambréis were broadly that France retained Calais for 8 years, after which an indemnity must be paid or Calais returned to England. She also kept the 3 bishoprics of Toul, Vets, and Verdun. All French positions in Tuscany were ceded to the Duke of Mantua or the Duke of Florence, Cosimo de' Medici. Spanish rights to Milan and Naples were recognized, and Brisay, Savoy, and Piedmont were all handed back to the Duke of Savoy. The only French possessions left in Italy were the Marquisate of Saluzzo and 5 strongholds in Piedmont, including the city of Turin. 2 marriage alliances were brokered to shore up the treaty. Henri and Catherine's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was to marry Philip of Spain, a widower since Mary Tudor had died on the 17th of November, 1558. Meanwhile, the Duke of Savoy agreed to take Henry's sister Marguerite as his bride. In short, Henry was surrendering gains and expensive possessions in Italy for territory and strength on the northeastern border of his kingdom. Although that's not how all of his subjects perceived the treaty at the time. Today, many people view the Treaty of Château Cambrésis as a strategic retrenchment that made France less vulnerable and more powerful. But Catherine was appalled when she heard the terms of the treaty. The unpopular Treaty of Château Cambrésis was officially ratified on April 3rd. With these external threats quelled, Henry could now focus on eliminating the Protestant movement from within the Kingdom of France. Or not. On June 30th, 1559, Henry decided to take part in a joust. During said joust, the King of France took a lance to the face. 10 days later, he died. On July the 10th, 1559, Henri II, King of France, breathed his last. Catherine now found herself in an unenviable position. Henry had elevated many families during his short reign, most of them from the conservative Guise faction. Now Catherine ran the risk of being overwhelmed by them. Her son was only 15 years old and still a child, and not a well one at that. Without other options, Catherine decided temporarily to throw in with the Guises, so long as to remain part of the Regency Council. That being said, Catherine saw this as a temporary move. She was determined to see her son rule in his own right. In the struggle for power ahead, Francis II had to emerge victorious. But with France now caught up, it's time to get back to affairs in England. When we were last discussing England directly, Edward VI was still very much a child. And that's where we'll pick it back up. And we're going to stay with England all the way through the death of Mary Tudor. As always, if you've enjoyed the show, check out the links in the show notes. I've got more content there, as well as a link to the website where you can find anything and everything you might need.